What's going on, all 1,040 of you beautiful people out there? Welcome to Axioms on Trial. I know we have 10 watching already at the beginning, but it just feels good to say, hey, all 1,040 of you. But anyway, today we got a really cool episode. We're going to go back in time a little bit and rehash a conversation that Cease had with Bryan here, who we only had one show with, but we've kind of had some, I think we've both had private conversations in the past, like here and there. So I think we're at this point familiar to some degree of each other's worldviews, or at least enough to kind of navigate through them and ask some questions. And so that's kind of what we're going to do today. Is we're gonna kind of compare each worldview and look at explanatory scope, or look at how it is exactly it refers to the shared reality we have, find some differences or similarities and differences there, and kind of see where we agree and differ. Cease, what are you expecting out of this? And did you want to introduce Bryan once we go into it?
Yeah, sure. I'm expecting to be a great conversation like it was last time. For everyone who didn't see the original or the first episode, I believe it was episode. Actually, I can't remember exactly, but the title says "Conversation with Pastor Bryan on existentialism and God, etc." I'll look up which number it was and let people know. But I think
it's in the 20s or something, maybe somewhere in there.
I forget exactly. I think it's actually probably in the 30s. But anyway, it was definitely an enjoyable conversation. And I gotta say that this is gonna sound kind of asshole-ish, but there's not a lot of theists who I've engaged with that I found myself truly connecting with on an intellectual level. That I felt. I mean, I obviously respect people as people, regardless, but intellectually, I've not heard a lot of approaches to these conversations that I felt were really particularly sophisticated. And Bryan is an exception to that. And so, I appreciate him coming on, and I feel like he engages these conversations in an honest way. And yeah, episode 27, that's where we talked last. So yeah, I'm excited to get into this and hopefully find more common ground.
Yep, and I'm happy that I beat you. It was the 20s and not the 30s, just like I beat you in our anti-realism debate, and you got crushed. No, I'm just kidding. But anyway, I'm still, for the people that may have watched that episode and then now they're on to this one, maybe you just went back to back. There's still a part 3 to that. There's a lot that I'm navigating in that realm. Still, I'm not leaned on the realism side. It's more of a navigation for me on the anti-realism side, whether as like an ethical subjectivist or error theorist, or whether I even lean towards the cognitivist perspective. But we'll get into that on the part 3 for that, and we'll go ahead and have Mr. Pastor Bryan next to join in.
Mike, I still have faith that you'll see the light at some point.
Yeah, faith. Well, I need more than faith, buddy. No. Well, so it's cool because hopefully in part 3, we have a buddy of ours that when we started the channel, we were going to try to get him on a good bit. And I think now he's able to actually come on a little bit more. And so maybe we'll have him on there, and it'll be like 3 completely different positions on there that I think would be interesting. And then we can also do consciousness at some point. But anyway, enough of me rambling. Mr. Bryan, do you want to give the audience a little background on yourself, anything you think is important to the conversation, or just things you want to brag about? I mean, I don't see any problem with that.
Sure, yeah. I mean, no, I'm excited to continue our conversation. Cease and I were talking a little bit before the show, and I love philosophy. My training is in biblical studies, and so philosophy is kind of just a passion of mine. But it's also deeply meaningful to me, and so I really just appreciate being able to talk about it, because I don't have these are not the kinds of conversations I get to have on a day in, day out. And so I really appreciate the chance to experience again.
Well, I'm glad that it's been positive for you, because we try to keep, I know the last time I think it was just you and Cease, and we try to keep usually like, let's just go like a little one-on-one, not to overwhelm either the theist or whoever is in here kind of by himself. This, now we've started morphing into more of a roundtable discussions with those things, which is kind of what we'll do today. I still want to have you guys go over your kind of points and create that gap from the last show. But I did want to say thank you for that. And to your point, when you say like saying these things out loud, it's kind of the same for me. And I don't know about Cease, but when I go back and watch certain episodes, hearing things I say out loud, I'm like, well, let me look back into that. You can go back and look at me and say, I deny the Izot problem. Now I don't take that position anymore. So like, I think it's the same thing in that sense, which is like, you look at these things and you start to hear yourself or hear how you say it, and then go, well, actually, let me look further into that. And I think that's a very good thing to navigate in.
Yep.
But Cease, so I'm going to kick it to Cease, and maybe Cease, you can, I don't know if you remember last time, I'm a little foggy on the last conversation. Maybe you can kind of, since you two had it, or Bryan, or which one of you two, and then I'll shut up for a little bit and I'll chime in whenever I feel it's necessary.
Sounds good. So where we left off, rewatching that conversation that we had, I recognize that to some degree we were actually kind of talking past each other in the sense that we were defining the term somewhat differently. I had challenged you on this idea that the reason why I'm not religious is because I think that religion fails to separate the imaginary versus the actual, versus the real.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was using the term imaginary, I think we were defining those terms differently.
Right.
You were taking an approach about sort of metaphor and symbolism and the concept that even through sort of a metaphorical approach, you can still get at existential truths about our condition.
Right.
And actually, I agree with you there. I don't think that I find value in metaphor. I find value in art and literature and symbolism. I've been exposed to enough Eastern and African philosophy where I do think that you can have a sort of symbolic approach to certain questions that can sort of help illuminate something that is actually real about our experience. But that is not what I was referring to or how I was defining imaginary. I literally meant the difference between, if I think about a glass of water versus I have a glass of water in my hand that I'm experiencing and touching sort of firsthand in that way. And where I guess my point is that how does your worldview show that these ideas you have about existentialism and how you define God, which I think I'll ask you again to sort of elaborate on how your perspective on what God means,
sure,
how that can be rooted in something concrete, in experience, as opposed to simply what we've imagined a narrative that doesn't actually grasp something real about existence. That is just something that we imagine.
Sure. So I think maybe, I know we were talking about a little bit about this off air, but I think it'd be helpful just to recapitulate this idea a little bit for the listeners about the idea of the image, the symbolic, and the real. So these are all taken from Lacan, and the way that Lacan talks about this is you have the image, the imaginary, which is the particular image that represents something. But that image is based in some sort of symbolic substrate. So you have the image, the symbolic, and the symbolic is the maybe idea, value that the image is derived from. Like you might have the image of the Dudley Do-Right character taking down the bad guy as the particular image, and the symbolic substrate is that the myth of redemptive violence, for example, the Dudley Do-Right beats up the bad guy. And then you have the real, and what happens is with the real is what breaks down those other two things. It's not that those other two things are not based in ontology. It's not that those other two things don't correspond to something to something real, but it's that the world itself, experience existentially, starts to push and break these things down, and so they're constantly in conversation with one another and being built and rebuilt and torn down. And for Lacan, Lacan says that those are always held in tension. That these elements are because of the way that human beings experience the world, these elements always exist. And so when we're talking about how do we determine imaginary and real, I think you're right. We have to be very careful of how we're talking about this, because when I say imaginary, as Lacan's talking about imaginary, I'm not talking about something that I made up that's arbitrary. I'm talking about a thing that I experienced, that I have constructed something based on my experience as through symbolic language to be an image. And so it's not so much for me the idea that we are pulling things out of whole cloth. It's more that we are existentially deriving the images that we use. And the qualia of that experience is real. If that makes any sense. I don't. Again, like I was telling you, this is not my training. So this is all. I'm trying to articulate this the best I can.
So I think I understand your approach here, and I understand. And I get where you're coming from. I do want to push back a little bit on that, because
sure.
I think it would help to figure out how it is that we're defining real in this context. Like, it can be like I can have an experience of connectedness, connection with the universe, right? Mm-hmm. That on its own, like, the experience may be real, but what that informs us ontologically doesn't necessarily point to anything real. I can have an experience that, this life isn't the only one that I've had or will have. And now you might want to say that maybe that experience is imaginary in a different way than Lacan means it. Which
I would, but keep going. I want to hear where you're going with this.
Okay. I guess what I'm saying is that, I'm very skeptical about what can be inferred ontologically. I think that it's one thing to talk about, well, regardless of what is true ontologically, I know I exist because I'm having an experience. So that at least I can be certain of. I can be certain of the fact that certain actions, certain behaviors have a specific result on my psychology, yes. Which is why I am more realist.
Yes.
But all of that is more a description of what I experience internally, rather than an external claim about what is the case sort of outside of us. So when you say things like
yes.
So when you say something like, God exists in our coming together in a conversation, which is, you said something along those lines. Like there is something.
Yeah, I would say something like that. Yeah.
I don't know. Well, one, I'm unsure what you mean by that.
Yeah.
And two, I'm unsure how you could determine that such a thing was actually the case, as opposed to a feeling or like I can have an experience. There's somebody in my room right now, and I could be having a schizophrenic breakdown. Right?
Yes.
Like the experience on its own doesn't necessarily tell me anything about the ontology in this context, as far as I see it.
Yeah, I think I see where you're going. So there are a couple different ways that I might go with this. Let me think. Okay, so remind me to come back to Levinas here in a second, because I think he's really helpful for this. But that's not the one I want to go, because you said something that sparked something in my brain. So your essential question, I think, if I'm understanding you right, is when we're talking about things like God, that I in our conversation have never really stepped outside of the experience of the divine, that we experience psychologically internally. The question that I'm hearing from you is, well, okay, I get that, and that's all fine and good. But what does that say about out there? Like independent of human minds, independent of all this, is that a thing? Am I understanding your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll phrase it this way. I don't think you've offered, or religion in general has offered, a framework that can ground these experiences as anything more than psychological, as anything more than just.
So here's my, I think. How do I, this is so what I see here is it's a kind of what I think is a category error. So what I mean by that is, if I asked you, for instance, so you're a moral realist, right? So you believe that morality exists as a real thing, and I would even say you believe that it's an objective thing. But I think when we talk about that, we qualify objective, right? Because we don't mean, I think, that morality exists independent of human minds, right? I don't think that's what we mean.
Sure.
And so, for you to ask me the question, I get that God exists in the human mind. And I get that these qualia are experienced existentially, but what does that mean about ontology? I think it's the same kind of question to say, do moral facts exist independent of human minds? I think it's the same kind of question.
Okay, that's an interesting approach. Let me process that for a second, because when you say that this is experienced existentially,
yes,
I think part of that is I would want what you mean by that, like a description of what is that experience like? What is that experience?
That's a really good question, and there's really good work done on religious phenomenology. In fact, Sam Harris is actually very interested in religious phenomenology and what that experience might look like. I don't really think I can get too deep into it, what exactly I mean by that, but I mean, like, how do I put this? So, this might be a question that I actually don't have the answer to, and so I don't want to give an answer that'll be
you always
ad hoc or anything like that. But I think that's a good question to say. How about this? We talked about. I would say that this might be a good way to get back to Levinas. So Levinas says that you experience God in the other. That you, as you love the, because Levinas talks in religious terms as a Jewish person himself.
Sure.
He says you experience God in the other as you experience them in their otherness. that you deal with the uncomfortableness. One of the things that my French, I know no French, but the way that he talks about others is their symptoms. But in French, he has this different way of spelling it, and it's this idea that it takes on a religious connotation that they're symptoms, but they're prophets. And so the other is a way to experience your own limitation, your own deficiency, and they can make you aware of a higher sense of being. And I think that is at least one place that I might say we experience something of the divine.
So let me ask, and maybe this is way more on the lower side, like the layman side, but I'm trying to figure out, like, if you have the experience of God or whatever it is that you're attributing that to, like, what the difference for me would be, like, if I was convinced somebody told me there was $1 million in my bank account, right? And I had whatever experiential sensation or phenomenological experience on that, that it doesn't really matter. I mean, it doesn't indicate the truth value, especially once I find out that I've been lied to and I don't have that. And so what I'm wondering, on the same aspect of, like, God or whatever the otherness, or however you feel very attached to that, why that has any relevance at all, because clearly we have multiple examples where that has no relevance and just doesn't even matter.
Well, I think the idea, if I'm understanding your question correctly.
Sure. I'm also trying to do my best to understand specifically what the dialogue between you guys, and that hopefully I didn't miss something there that you had already went over there.
I think, you're talking about here, ask it one more time.
Sure.
Succinctly, if you can. So,
and maybe I missed the mark somewhere and you can show me where, but it seems like when I have whatever experiential status of God or whatever it is, I don't know, you said the otherness. I'm not too specific to probably speak on that, but that emotional value I get, or phenomenological experience that makes me feel like that is part of the world, right? That's the imaginary element to that it's now it's now kind of manifested itself into, maybe that's the case. Well, I don't see a difference between me being just very convinced in an elaborate scheme with a trail of empirical evidence that gets me to, like, I'm very convinced that I have $1 million in my bank account, almost to the point where it'd be foolish. But then I find out it's this giant elaborate plan. And then all of my feelings and the fact that I thought it was real didn't matter, because it just happened to be imaginary. And none of the indicators on my experiential status did anything to affect that. It just,
I think
not causally related to that, I guess is what I'm saying.
I think there's a little bit of the Izot problem going on here. So, you have here's what I mean by that. So your idea that how do I put this? So for most moral realists, right, you are justified in talking about objective moral values based on subjective experience, simply because those experiences necessitate a subject. But we can make objective claims about those subjective experiences.
Hold on. So let me clarify. Are you saying, like, if I think spicy food's really hot, like it is objectively the case that I subjectively?
No, let's talk about morals. Let's talk about morals. So like.
Well, so I'm wondering the distinction is between the fact of whether or not I have an objective subjective experience, or if whether or not you're talking about, like, the property of the food is objectively hot for everybody. Because those are two different distinctions on objective, I think, matter.
Well, let me paint it in the way that like a Sam Harris might. So you have the idea of the best possible world and the worst possible world, and what you have is the qualitative experience. That's what you have. to judge or justify. That's not epistemically justifiable. It's just not. It's existentially justifiable.
Yeah, I'm an anti-realist, so I probably won't disagree with some of what you'll say.
And so what I detect from you is you're saying, what is the epistemic justification for those experiences? And I don't know if there is one, honestly. I don't know if there's one.
Sure. So then why is there, like, if I'm person P, right, and I have an epistemic justification to get to fact X, right? Person P, and then you have fact X. There's a causal relation from person P to fact X, right? So there is a point at which person P can have some imaginative or some intentional state or whatever it can be that through an epistemic process, you actually do justify fact X in some way. Now, your definition of justification or whether you're a fallibilist or how you define knowledge, all that's really going to matter. Internalist, externalist, all that stuff will matter. But to set that aside for a minute, it seems like what's missing in what you're saying, as opposed to the things that I can imagine, make a hypothesis and then create a novel prediction, is actually the fact that I can have causal connection from person P to fact X through that epistemic justification, as opposed to on your side, I think that it's like abstract objects to me, or moral facts. I think we go back to moral facts. I don't see a causal connection from person P to moral fact X. I don't think that connection exists the same way to abstract objects like numbers, which is why I deny them. And so that's a similar problem I have here.
Yeah, so I can see a little bit of disconnect just in our approach because I am super, like, when it comes to the schools of philosophy, I am as far away as I can possibly be from just analytical philosophy. I am firmly in the continental.
Yeah, you both are. You both have that common thread. I'm really not into the continental side. Not that I have any problems with it. It's just not. It's not as much of my studies.
And it's also harder to talk about because when you can't syllogize a system, it's really difficult to articulate.
Agreed.
And I constantly struggle with that. And conversations like this help me tease that out. So.
So what would be that kind of, because you said there's a difference between the approach, and I don't know, maybe we all make progress there, but
so continental philosophy is rooted in is actually not rooted in I would say is not actually rooted in objective fact. It's rooted in relation. It's rooted in people and how we live and get along.
Sure.
And analytic is trying to get at all right, we're going to have these nice neat package statements that we can pick apart, and so
all the way down to, like, what does it mean to be a cat or natural? That's how ridiculous they can get. Yeah,
sure. Well, when you were talking about the idea of imagining things that have no correlation with reality, I don't think that's what's generally going on with people. I think what's generally going on is we have experiences, and the symbolic and image worlds that we construct correspond to those experiences. And so it's not as if we are saying that any arbitrary construction is valid. It's more that we're saying that.
Well, is there a criterion there? Because, like, that might be what I feel like would help be a distinction. Like, I'm going to have some criterion at which, like, I'll apply the imaginative or the hypothetical, or I'm sorry, the hypothesis to being subject to falsification, or whether or not it produces novel predictions in the first place, right? And that seems to be a criterion at which I'm going to derive from the imaginary. But I'm wondering, like, in comparison to yours, like, what's yours? Because that's gonna matter. It might, if it's good enough, or if it's better, if it produces better results, in my opinion, then I would switch to that. I feel like the criterion is gonna matter.
I think we're playing a different game when we're doing that, and so it's not about hypothesis and novel prediction. It's about the subjective experience of meaning, and those are very different games.
So
go ahead.
Can I ask you something? Because
yes,
a couple of things. Well, one, I heard earlier in the in the comment section, people were asking what was meant by otherness and by higher state of being. Maybe you can elaborate on that. My understanding of otherness from Levinas's perspective is that he's talking about, our interaction with other people and how it is that sort of illuminates our own experience in relation to the other.
Yes. Well, and one of the things that Levinas really, really wants to hit home is that we do not have access to the ontology of the other person, and we not have access to it. To even for him, and I think we talked about this last time, but for him, empathy is violence.
Yeah, I think that's where I disagree with him. I understand.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a strength to that argument, that the idea that if we're simply trying to reduce another person to an easily digestible, that their experience is my experience.
Sure.
That can be a form of violence.
I agree with that.
And so
I do agree with that.
I would say the thing that Levinas really, I think, helps us with is that we experience someone who is we don't have access to their experience, but we experience them, and it's in that relationship that we learn and we grow, and what I mean by a higher state of being there is this kind of goes back to the idea of symptom that he brings up, right? So that and he'll put it in terms of the larger society, right? So he would be like, if you want to know the other, you need to go to the prisons and see the people who are suffering under a society that is systemically unjust, and listen to them, listen to their experience, and then you will learn something about yourself, diagnose something about the society, and you will be better because of it. And so that's kind of what I mean by a higher state of being. It's kind of like the moral landscape, right? That we move along this spectrum.
I would say about Ed Levinas that he gets it half right, where I think that, yes, it's true that there is an element of or more than an element, that probably the majority of the other is beyond us. But I think, if we can both embrace the other for the sameness and the otherness, that is a better goal. I think the only way we can even have intelligible conversation is the sameness. Like there's right.
significant overlap, right? But it's that otherness that can work on us in kind of that transformative way. I don't know if that helps.
No, it does. The other question I wanted to kind of go along with what Mike was saying a couple of minutes ago, that you're saying that we're playing a different game when we talk about existentialism. We're approaching the conversation not so much epistemically, but existentially.
I think so.
So I want to say, as far as me being a more realist, I actually disagree that there is no epistemology that can be applied. Yeah. I obviously don't take that perspective. Now, Mike and I disagree on morality currently, so you're going to get different answers from us on that front.
So I have a question for you on that then. So like, when it comes to the idea of valuing well-being, right? Mm-hmm. Where my question is, if you think that is epistemically justified, how?
Because I think that is the value on its own is not arbitrary, like kind of like you were describing earlier.
Yeah.
I think it. So I take a phenomenological approach to the question of morality. I think it is grounded in phenomenology.
I don't. I think it's grounded in the experience. So it's actually not grounded in the phenomenon. Oh, I know what you're saying. The phenomenology, like the experience of the. I got you. I'm with you.
Yeah. So that's what I mean by that. Like the sort of our experience of it is in a sense an existential framework.
Right. Well, that's what I was going to say. Do you not see how that's at least as far as I understand what you're saying, that's a question that is existentially justified, not really epistemically justified. Like,
I think so here's why I disagree, because if we can look at human nature, we can look at the mechanistic components that result in our conscious experience being what it is, the psychological components. Like there's we can apply two different languages to this conversation, right? Like we can apply the sort of brain chemistry, stress levels, sort of scientific aspect or approach a linguistic game, or we can talk about it in terms of existentialism and phenomenology and that kind of thing. And it sounds like your claim is that when we're talking about the question of God, you're doing something similar to the second one, where you're playing a different kind of game, and the language is going to be different, and what you call justification is going to be different. But I am left to the question of, if we were just looking at experience, well, you're talking about we find the divine in our interaction. Now, I don't know what you mean by experience of the divine, and how do we then contrast it to those who don't experience that kind of description, who don't have a sense of something greater than themselves.
So this will be, I think, a good place to talk a little bit about some of the stuff we already talked about that we haven't brought up so far. So I went over, I think, like 4 different ways that people talk about God when they talk about God. The first is like super being, right? Like this that we're strong, God's omnipotent, that kind of thing. That God is an object out there that we can, it's just independent of us, out there exists. And that, I think, is mostly a ridiculous idea, and we can talk about why if you want. But the next one is God is hyper being, like that God is not this object that exists, but that God is. To talk about God is to not talk about God. We talked about that a little bit last time, and I don't want to spend the whole time going over that conversation. And so if I need to clarify things, please let me know. But then you have God as the ground of being, or the thing that allows us to experience it all. And then you have God as event. And so these 4 kind of different ways of talking about God are all over the Christian tradition. They're all over a lot of other faith traditions.
Is that limited to the 4?
I probably not. But from what I see,
well, I just wanted to say, like, if you mention how it could be, I think that to me highlights like the problem of the imaginary to me, to go, well, I don't see why we stop at 4. Like, I think that the problem with the imaginary in this aspect that I have a problem with is in a similar sense of like solipsism or something. Like, you can just postulate like all day long different other ontologies that could be the case that we're not actually experiencing, the same way where I don't know that the definition of God seems to be only based upon the imaginary and nothing else to go with that. And so my thing is,
so are you saying there's no,
I don't know how you distinguish one claim from the other, essentially, because to me they're on the same grounds of being just as equally imaginary as the last one you provided.
Because you just said God. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead, Cease, and then I'll.
Well, just based on what Mike just said, because one of the 4 you just mentioned was God is what what allows for the experience. Yeah. That is a claim that now is beyond an existential claim. That is a claim about ontology and reality that is outside of us. That is sort of the grounding for the experience itself.
Right, the grounding of being. Yeah. That would be what that is.
Well, that's something that I would have an issue with. It's like, well, how do we make that claim and know that claim is capturing something true?
Yeah. So I would say that when it comes to how do I put this? So with those four things, I probably lean most towards God as event. That's where I find myself, and so I see weaknesses in each of the others. But what I would say is, for the people who want to talk about God as the ground of being, for me, whatever that is, whatever ontology is, it exists, and what word we pick for that, I think is not super consequential, but that definitely exists outside of us, and I think what's how do I put this?
I guess my question is, like, in virtue of what is it? Because, like, for me to make a grounds of something that might be the basis, or anything that I make, you're filtering that through sense data or through your own phenomenological experience. And I don't know in virtue of what could give you the grounding for that claim, as opposed to any other kind of imaginative speculation on what that could be.
Well,
they seem to be on
really
par, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying, but I don't really see the problem with that. And what I mean by that is,
okay, go ahead. Sorry.
What I mean by that is, to say that there is a thing that is ontology is not really that big of a claim.
I don't have a problem with that. I have a problem with what specific basis for ontology that you've now leaped to. Like, are you making the claim that there is some ontology there? Like, sure, that's fine, but like designating it or diagnosing what it is, to me, seems to be
what I'm doing. That's not what I'm doing. So I think,
okay.
What I'm doing is, when people talk about God, these are four ways that they do so, right? So this is purely descriptive. Sure. And so the idea for me is, well, how does that function? How does that inform their lives? What difference does that make? And so those are the questions that I ask. For me, it's not so much, I don't care what you call it. I don't. I don't. But for me, it's the way, the manner in which these beliefs function, that becomes the central issue. And so these ways of talking about God are all problematic in their own way. And I think that for the Christian tradition, that's actually, well, we can dive into that, but that's
what
actually
I wanted
part of the design.
That's what I think is important in these conversations, that I kind of put, and that's nothing against you or anything, because I think groundwork's definitely important, but I find it somewhat odd from the theist perspective that when we talk about these types of things, we kind of argue for a general brand of theism in some cases, and all the metaphysical baggage that really matters at the forefront, that should be explored at the very beginning, atonement, Trinity, all these types of things, that adds so much more baggage to the ontology that you postulate. But the problem is, it's like it seems like we don't even consider that until after the actual fact. And I'm going, well, how do we do that? Because when I present naturalism or something like that, I am pressed to make sure I'm counting for everything. I don't get to, like, later on kind of say, well, also, like, the singularity also gave birth to a different thing that killed itself to appease things, right? Like that. And I'm not doing that to insult or something, but it does seem like we throw that at the back end when it should be packaged in with that. Otherwise, we're at this kind of weird realm of deism. And then
So I actually fully I fully agree with that intuition that you have. So, but what you would characterize probably as some of the metaphysics stuff, for me, it's but probably because the particular brand of Christian thought that I've embraced is not that big of a deal for me. And so for me, right, the primary Christian image, right, is the cross. And we talked about this a little bit last time, Cease, that the cross is kind of the original punk rock, right? So it's this, you have these ideas of super beings, that you have all, even the term Son of God is kind of this Roman idea of the ruler on whom the God has favor. And what the cross does is it takes these symbolic and image and smashes them to pieces, like that they hold no water, because you've got the crucified Messiah, where the image is broken down completely, and you even see this illustrated a little bit in the Gospels themselves when Jesus is crucified. I think it's in Luke. No, it might be in Matthew. I can't remember. Where the curtain of the temple is torn.
Yeah, well, it depends on which one, because it's torn before in one and torn after in another.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't know how is reconcilable. I mean, like, Bart gives a good example to say, like, you could say it ripped and then it ripped all the way, but then it's like,
yeah.
To me, that's like using the Judas kind of thing, where it's like, well, his guts did burst out and he was hung because he fell on top of the thing.
Yeah, he fell.
Like,
that's right. Yeah.
But my thing is, like, when people fall, they fall feet first. They don't fall face first when they're hanging. Their feet are dangling.
I think it'd be a really interesting conversation to talk about biblical Dexters. That's actually my training.
I love that
stuff.
Yeah, so I'd love
that would be very, very interesting. I would say, I mean, there's a lot I could say there, but what you see there represented is the idea that this holy place to the people, this curtain's ripped. That this God is super being, this God, this warrior God, this thing that you thought justified yourselves and condemned your enemies. That's not what it's about. God's dying on a tree. That's what this is. It's kind of this undermining of the entire system. And so when we're talking about trying to get to the particulars of religious faith, as we're talking about a lot of these big questions, for me, the starting place is the cross. The starting place is the idea that you have the system that you've constructed that you want to use to justify yourself, your moral beliefs, condemn your enemies. Get rid of that, because it has no place. And in fact, you need to be the proper position is awe, not certainty. The proper position is, and so there's a lot that goes into that. But that is baked into the heart of the Christian narrative, that the cross is a confrontation with the absurd. And we can go into how that particularly works out in kind of like maybe Camus' idea of the absurd, or Kierkegaard, or any of that. But that's kind of I think your intuition is right. These distinctions are important, because I'm not generally defending theism or deism, these God as object. I'm actually defending the Christian deconstruction of the notion of God, which is a very different idea, because the Christian, one of the things that's inherent in Christianity is the deconstruction of the notion of God, and that's not just a thing that goes on once. It is a continual process. And so I'll let you respond. I've talked and probably rambled a little bit, but
no, you're good. I guess I would, if you do take it from that perspective of adding, and I'll pass back to Cease here, but when you take the elements of having, let me just ask you this: like, would you say like Adam and Eve are metaphorical? Or were they really people that created original sin for Jesus to have died for?
Okay, so we okay, all right. So here's what I'll say, specifically about. Well, okay, there's a couple ways I want to approach.
Well, so let me better this way. I don't want to be rude. Is it easy to give a yes or no and then elaborate or elucidate on after I make the point? Because I don't want to forget the point I'm going to make.
So
if we go on to
ask the question one more time, and then I'll see if I can give you.
Yeah. So from like the metaphorical or that type of thing, I think you had talked about with Cease at the beginning, and then even on the last show a little bit. what's baked into that, right? And especially when you're referencing to the ontology, what's baked into that is like a very specific creation notion. I'm very against the idea that you could say it's a metaphor, just from the standpoint of you start to cover your tracks on where things really go wrong. Because from my perspective, if Adam and Eve don't exist, right, there was no original sin, and Jesus had literally no reason to die. It was all for nothing.
Let's talk about that for a second. So I have read several books on that exact subject. And so literally on the subject, if there is no original sin, what did Jesus die for? So it's a big thing. My short answer to your question is Adam and Eve were never real people. That's my short answer to your question.
Okay.
The way that I would characterize one of the difficulties of the cross, right? If you talk to Christians, there are actually a variety of atonement theories, right? There's penal substitutionary atonement, which is kind of what you were talking about, right? That there's this guilt on mankind that Jesus atones for and satisfies the wrath of God. But there's also things like Christus exemplar, like that Jesus's life and death and resurrection were things that show us what it's really like to be truly human, and that deals not with sin in some sort of guilty way.
Can we take those two right there? Sorry to cut you off, but like this is the point that I thought was going to emerge, was that if you say no, and then we go into different aspects about the atonement, now because of the faulty aspect of the imagination or the metaphor in the first place, we've just like branched off more imaginative things to
I don't think that's what's going on. So what I think is going on.
Well, real fast, because when you say like it could be this, that, or that, there's no mechanism. From the beginning, there was no mechanism to tell the real thing. And then now as we further go along, it branches, and every one of those things are on a par where there's no mechanism to determine which is true. I don't actually
think that's what's going on. What I think is going on is that the cross itself, right? So we talked about how the cross is this deconstruction of the notion of God, is a Christian deconstruction of the notion of God. I also think that the cross, because of what it is, how it is this forced encounter with the absurd. To me, it is no surprise that there are a bunch of different theories on what did that do. Mm-hmm. That's not for me. That's not a consequence of we're trying to cover our tracks. For me, that's a consequence of the experience of the event. And so to go back to your Genesis stuff for a second.
Yeah, sure.
So you talked about how there's this problem rooted in the creation story itself, but you know as well as I do, because I've seen some of your own your content on this, that there's not one creation story. There's two, and they're contradictory. This is not a system that was built on one notion of reality. If you look in the Old Testament itself, there is a constant tension between kind of this dogmatic element and the prophetic element, and they push against one another. You have, I'll give you an example. One of my favorites. So, like in the book of Ezra, right? They come back from Babylon, and Ezra says, all the priests, we need to go ahead and divorce these foreign women because we want to keep ourselves pure for Yahweh or whatever. And the book of Ezra continues. They do that. They send them away. They send away their children. It's this horrible thing. And the book never addresses that. They say, oh, yay, we did that. We're going to celebrate it. And then you have the book of Malachi, the prophet, right? So you have Ezra, which is kind of like the official thing. You have Malachi, and Malachi chapter 2, right, comes up and says, the Lord hates divorce. You have made the altar an altar of tears. You've done this terrible thing. You have these competing ideas, and you even see these in the creation stories themselves.
So wouldn't the mechanism between the two matter? Because that's the whole point I'm trying to highlight. That like if I give you a note that says your house is on fire, and then I also give you a note, like I write you a poem about it, right? I just give you a poem and says like your house is on fire, and then I write you a poem where you go, okay, well this one seems like my house isn't on fire. What do you do to go find out? You go check, right? You go look, you observe, you look at the empirical data. That solves the dilemma, right? Now I don't see an situation where that shouldn't be welcome, right? Like, I don't know why we avoid that.
I think the issue is, I don't think that's what's going on. I don't think we're trying to say your house is on fire or you're going to hell. I don't think that's what's going on in the biblical text.
Well,
not
the hell
thing.
I'm not doing it for hell. I'm sorry to cut you off. It's not the hell thing. It's just to say, like, if I write you a poem and it gives you the idea that maybe my house is on fire, and then you read something else and it's like, nope, your house isn't on fire. I'm like, well, I don't know which metaphor. Like, first off, the metaphor was a bad way to tell me whether or not. Just tell me if my house is on fire, right? Seems
okay,
that everybody will understand it. And then the second point is, how do I distinguish between the two imaginative contradictory ideas? Well, I actually look at the empirical perspective. Sorry.
I think you're talking past each other, it seems to me, because
sorry, that might be my bad.
For me, it's just it's a non sequitur. Like, that's what's going on is not like a question of, oh, is your house on fire or not? It's what does it mean to be human? Right? That's a very different kind of question. And it's not a question you could answer with a note. Nor is it a question I think you could answer with a syllogism. That's partially why I think that analytic philosophy is ultimately lacking. But for me, this isn't about the idea that this book is dropped out of heaven, right, for people to know God. It's more. This is a very human book, and anybody who takes a close reading of it knows this. Anybody who takes a close reading knows this is a very human book about what it means to be human and what it means to relate to reality, and what it does is it builds on itself. It contradicts itself. It is a conversation that we're invited into, and that the cross is the kind of you're asking for a mechanism, right? I think that might be it for the Christian tradition. Sorry, J-Mac, you're muted.
I was on such a long streak for not doing that. Yeah, no, I and I'm not like accusing, like, I don't want to accuse you or something, but it's when we go through it, it's like, it seems like we avoid a mechanism, or it's like, even if we brush back to you go, we're asking a different question. It's the human experience. Okay, well then what about that towards me, my experience, like I said earlier, about me thinking I have $1 million in the bank, or I convinced myself, or whatever C said about schizophrenia, about an experience. Nothing about that relegates to the fact that it's actually happening. And you could say there's actual things going on in the brain that are causing those, right? But there's no like new ontology. You would not be justified to say that the person in your room that you see is of some new ontological nature because of your experience. That would be absurd. And we know it's absurd because we could look at like a D1, the dopamine like model. I'm not too familiar with it, but I think it's like D1, D2 receptors or something like that. We can look at it and go, okay, that's kind of the cause there, as opposed to just, okay, I can extrapolate from the pure experience alone. I think that's faulty. I think that's like, it's like not being rigorous enough whenever.
I got a question for you then.
Sure.
I don't disagree with what you're saying, but what else, if you're not relying on your experiential faculties, what are you relying on?
Well, of course, you have to rely on your sense data. My point is the pure thought, or the pure, like, because it seems like, so I've never had this idea that like God exists. That's always been foreign to me, right? I didn't even know God was like a thing until I was like 9 or 10. Someone mentioned it.
Sure.
And I was like, you believe in God? Like, what is that? So that is, I never get that when people appeal to that. And that's what I feel like that's going towards.
Yeah, but I would say that you, and you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, but you've probably experienced.
My fan's going off, so I'm going to mute my mic. So you know.
Sure.
What about your sense data tells you the divine? I think is the question.
Yeah. So this is. I think this will go right into that question. So you've probably experienced and this might even be one of the reasons you love doing this with Cease, right? The sublimeness of engaging with another person genuinely, to experience their difference, and that is for in that how do I put this? That experience is, this is the difficulty I ran into earlier trying to talk about religious phenomenology, because there is religious phenomenology, and it's hard to put into words. let me see here.
I think there is phenomenology that you're after the fact trying to reframe through religious language. Obviously, yes, we can have an experience of meaning through our conversations and experience of each other. But what does it mean to call that divine as opposed to sort of the existential purpose that is derived from existing and finding common ground with people?
Yeah, well, and one of the things I would say to that is that I don't know if it really matters what we call it. For me, I'm a proponent of the Christian tradition, really for myself. You won't. One of the most useless fields, I think, is apologetics, because for one, I have never seen an apologetic argument that was trying to convince someone of Christianity that I thought was intellectually honest. For me, I don't think that we need the religious. Maybe that's the wrong way to put it. I don't think that the religious language talking about these experiences is absolutely necessary. I think that I would say that you would experience what I would call divine, right? Regardless of whether or not you believe in any sort of notion of supernaturalism, right? I would say that. I would even say that humanity itself has divinity.
What are you defining divine? What do you call?
Yeah, no. This is one of those things that I think we talked about this off air, that you might be able to help tease out, because this is really hard to get into words, because divinity is, I think, some of the things what people might talk about, like Sam Harris might talk about it as a preferable state of being, right? That the ultimate conception of the best possible world would be divine.
So it's just a description of something that you think we should strive towards.
And also, I think existentially calls to us.
Sure.
And so I for me, that's an important distinction.
Let me say this, and God, I hope this doesn't come off.
Please go ahead.
But it seems to me that you are an atheist who's using your religious traditional language to express. Mike, I think I hear you.
Yeah, there's a little echo there.
I'm torn, because ultimately it seems like an issue of semantics, right? Like, if you want to talk about a meaningful experience, you want to call it divine, or you want to call it existentially meaningful.
Meaning, that's great. Meaning is a good word. That's a great word. Keep going. Yeah.
What you call it is not particularly, like, I agree with you. It doesn't really matter. Like, what matters is how we're describing and valuing the experience. But, if you want to use the Christian tradition and the language that it's found in it to illuminate something about your experience in the world, okay, fair enough. Like, you're not there making a statement about ontology. You're using a sort of a strategy to make sense of your experience through symbolism. I
wouldn't even say necessarily. Go ahead. What are you gonna say?
No, go ahead.
I wouldn't necessarily even say through symbolism, but I think your intuition is right. That this language is historically and culturally rooted, and it helps you can use it to help make sense of the world. I don't know that it is necessary to do that. I don't know that it is. What I do know is in terms of, let's talk about Western civilization, right? For example, right? So what I do know is that much of Western thought is nested in the Christian tradition, whether or not it's aware of it. And that can begin to complicate things very quickly. But you were going to say something before I cut you off.
Well, yeah, two things. On one hand, it sounds like you're saying that you're trying to have a different type of conversation, that the approach is an existential one and not an analytic one, which I actually can appreciate to a degree, because, like I said, I'm in the middle of the continental analytic divide. I do think there's value in the continental philosophy. But then on the other hand, it's like you make statements that from my perspective start to bleed over onto the other realm. And maybe it's a limitation of our language, that it's hard to talk about what we think is the case without going there. But the other thing is that your interpretation of the Christian tradition, which I prefer over most interpretations that I've heard, seems to be so counter to what is actually going on and how these books are interpreted. And much of what, and again, you're the scholar here, not me, but when I read the Bible, a lot of what I see is not this question, this kind of mirror to what is it like to be a human. It's, here's these rules and these things and these claims about reality that you should accept.
Yeah. So, there's a lot to unpack there. So part of what I would say is, first off, you did not offend me. A lot of times when people ask me, are you an atheist or a theist? And I say, well, I'm an atheist to the fundamentalist notion of God, right? And so you didn't offend me on that at all. But what I would say about the biblical text, right? So I think one of the problems that fundamentalists run into, especially if they're really trying to wrestle with the biblical text and take it seriously, is they run into the issue that these texts are compiled over centuries from lots of very different kinds of perspectives, and they're all, and not all of them agree. Whenever somebody says to me, the Bible says X, right? I always groan, like it hurts my soul when they say that, because it would almost be like saying, because the Bible is a library of libraries. Like even these individual books are these massive compositions from various sources. And so whenever they say things like the Bible says, to me, it sounds like the Library of Congress says it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, right? Like it's well, okay, there is a book in the Library of Congress that says this thing, right? But that's not the message of the Library of Congress. You know what I mean? And so we have this issue where people look at a very small section of these texts from a very narrow point of view, and they take that as prescriptive for today, and that's a problem. And I think we could all agree that that's a problem. Yeah. And so the question is, well, how do we? Is there a way to engage with these texts in a way that doesn't render them meaningless, but also allows us to engage with them. And I think the biblical tradition itself, is, as you take it in, you see the biblical text doing this itself. There's, I can think of a couple of examples. One of them is you have in Exodus, right? So God describes himself as one who will punish the sins of the father on the son, even to the, I think, third and fourth generation. And then you have in Ezekiel saying that the son doesn't suffer for the sin of his father. And so what somebody might say, right, is, I even thought of a better one. In, I think it's Psalm 46 or something like that, or Proverbs 46. There is a verse, and they're right next to each other. Like this is one of the best examples of this I can think of. They're right next to each other. And you know what? Actually, I'm going to look it up because it'll be fun for people to know. I think it's 26, 46, something like that. Yeah. I can't think of it.
Shout out to Captain Dadpool for having that AOL dial-up connection. Hopefully you still have that, buddy.
Oh yeah, so it's Proverbs 26, verse 4. It says, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will be like him yourself." Right? And so the obvious application there is like, if somebody's a fool, don't even bother, right? Or you'll end up looking like an idiot. The very next verse says, "Answer a fool according to his folly, or else he will be wise in his own eyes." It's the very next verse. And it's not like these people are idiots, right? It's not like they're dumb. I think people look at ancient people and because they're ignorant, we think they're dumb, and they're not. What's going on, I think, in that it shows us in that book of Proverbs illustrates something really important, that by putting those right next to each other, what the author's doing is inviting us to engage in the act of wisdom. And that process is not, and that invitation is not unique to those two verses. It permeates the whole text.
What does engaging in the act of wisdom mean?
Ooh, that's okay. So a full unpacking of that idea. There's a book that does it really well. I'm not going to be able to do it here because it's a big. It's a book by Peter Enns, who is a pretty well-known New Testament scholar. The book is called "How the Bible Actually Works," in which I explain how an ancient, ambiguous, and diverse book leads us to wisdom rather than answers. And that is, it's an excellent text. And so if anybody is looking to get into that, that's a good place to do. What I'll say about it here is the act of wisdom is it's navigating that space, right? So there are times where it is best. Let's take that Proverbs 26 example, right? There are times where it's best to not answer a fool, right? If someone's being a jackhead, we don't need. There's sometimes you just let them be, and then there's times where if somebody's being an idiot, it's time to say something. And so the question is, how do you know which one is which? What would you say to that, C? So if I asked you, what would you say to that?
No, I think I agree. You have to sort of, depending on this context of the situation, depending on your particular mental state in the moment, depending on their mental state, depending on what the conversation is, there may be times to speak up and times to go about your day. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair assessment.
Right. And so for me, when people want to say that the Bible provides these contextless, timeless truth prescriptions, I'm like, you're not reading the same book I am. You're just not.
Right.
And so I don't know if that gets to kind of what you were.
No,
you were
I guess
asking
my concern is to what, like, yes, I believe and I agree that you can come up with examples like that, right? Which I think show the text to potentially be more sophisticated than a lot of people get credit for. On the other hand, we could both come up with many other examples of verses that don't seem to be doing that. That seem
you
to
just
be
do that in science books. So you just like anything we had gotten wrong that was sophisticated was not, the sophistication had nothing to do with the validity of it.
Right. So, but I would say in that context, that example, I think it is a good one. Like to be aware that there are times when to engage and when times not to. But the point is that you seem to be framing the Bible as a whole as being this sort of context for that kind of struggles with itself and functions as a mirror to illuminate our experience. And I don't know, I'm not saying that you're wrong, but I don't know to what degree it is mostly that or sometimes that. I guess what I'm saying is you're arguing for what religion should be rather than what religion is.
No, I know. And so your intuition that there are biblical texts that don't do this at all. I think that's a good intuition, because what we see here is how the biblical text will sometimes fight with itself. Let's see. How do I put this?
And if I mean, we can answer we'll post some questions from the audience.
Sure. But there are some texts that are just not. I mean, let's talk about what I think is probably one of the most famous texts that people bring up to talk about the moral deficiencies of the Bible, which is any of the Old Testament laws on slavery, right? Like any of them, they're all bad, and they're all objectively bad. They're just not good, and so you say, well, what does that do to the usefulness of this book if there are things like that in it? And what I would say, I guess from my perspective, is how do I put this? Okay, so from my perspective, the image of the cross is primary, and that informs our as religious people. That informs the whole thing, and so that you would look to that before you would look to these other things and have that inform it. But if I want to say just in terms of the biblical story, you have the idea of these slaves, and then you have right next to it, in fact, just a couple chapters earlier, God liberating slaves, and you have these ideas that are held in tension, and they're. I don't want to minimize, right, because those texts on slavery, right, were used by white Southern Christian slave owners here in the United States to justify their owning of other people. But then you also have people like the Quakers, right, who looked at the grand narrative of Scripture and said, there's no reason to own another human being. And so I don't know if there's a clean answer to your issue there, but for me, that's not actually a problem. I don't know if there is a clear answer for you.
No, let me just.
Anything you want to add?
Well, I want to add something in the comment. Like, if someone comes with a username like "why non-believers are idiots" and then they spam in all fucking caps like "let me in," I don't like, dude. I want nothing to do with you in my life. Like, in fact, get out of the chat room. Like, we don't need you. Anyway, sorry. Like, that's so ridiculous. Like, we're having a civil conversation. I hate that shit. It's just so toxic. Yeah. Anyway, well, so with my internet connections and stuff, I came in at a weirder time on the trying to fit back into where you guys were at. My contention is really just going to lie to, like, I don't think like the stuff that's mentioned, like the cross is primary or these types of things. Like, for me, and at least how my epistemology works, like I don't start with things like that. Like, yes, of course, we have to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and assume certain things in order for things to get off the ground. And I'm okay with that, but from like a divine or especially from a metaphysical standpoint, I'm so skeptical in that, because I don't see what would stop me from doing the same thing with any other set of beliefs that had some origin before I was born. Right? I'm blocked off from that time, and it seems to me that's like it's the vagueness, it's the ambiguity of the fact that you're removed from the events to me. That almost seem to like come in and save the perspective in some ways, because it's like, I mean, you can just kind of take that and go any route you want, and it seems every route you go is equally justified, and by that I mean not at all.
So what I would say a little bit to that is, so far nothing I've said requires the adoption of any sort of metaphysic.
I would disagree. I mean, if there's the ability, the fact that if the cross is as important it is, and it symbolizes, I would assume, atonement and Jesus, and whether Jesus is God.
Yeah, but I haven't mentioned any of that, right? In fact, but
that was my problem at the beginning only, is that like, because we don't mention that, like that's kind of the problem. We should.
But I would even dispute some of that, right? So I would even dispute the idea of like penal substitutionary atonement, any of that as capturing something that's ontological.
That's not of some new ontological category for you? It seems to be clearly the case.
Maybe I'm just not understanding what you're saying.
Well, I mean, there's so much metaphysical baggage in just that idea of the atonement, and like that's why I don't
reject that idea, right?
Under what grounds? So I don't know how. It's like saying I reject that 2 + 2 = 4 analytically. It's like, it just is the case. I mean, I don't see where you can even have grounds for a disagreement
on penal substitutionary atonement.
That it's not of some metaphysical, that it shouldn't be. It's not baked into some metaphysical baggage that's part of the initial.
I don't think he's saying that is not metaphysical. I think he's saying that he rejects that metaphysics to begin with.
Yeah, I reject the metaphysic.
Like you don't believe in atonement in that sense of. So like,
I would reject the metaphysic.
Well, yeah. So wait. Okay. So I feel like I'm hearing two things. I'm hearing you reject just metaphysics in general.
No, that metaphysic, that particular.
Oh, okay. So I definitely heard that first part wrong. Second one was, I'm not even trying to be specific. I'm trying to be vague on that. It doesn't matter what. I guess my point is, it doesn't matter what take you take on the atonement. They're equally imaginary from my perspective. And they all have metaphysical baggage. Every one of them.
Right, but I reject the idea of atonement as a metaphysical reality.
Well, so that understanding that from that perspective doesn't get you to a higher level of what the metaphysics are in that worldview, because I feel like it clearly does. I feel like it's like the biggest bridge to understanding that, right? Because I mean, now you're transcending something completely different than which was the initial claim was from experience. I mean, now we're talking about something that kind of goes against any experience there. Now I'd have to probably get into specifically what your position is on the atonement, because I don't want to. It does seem like I'm painting you in a spot that you don't agree with there, and I don't want to keep doing that. But
so even the way that you phrase that shows me that we're not speaking the same language.
Sure.
Because I don't have a position on the atonement. I don't think that Jesus's death satisfied a thing to free us from guilt. I don't think that's a thing that happened. And I don't think.
Well, we could remove the atonement. I'm saying like anything within that Christian worldview is going to be indicating some. There's going to be some link there to your metaphysics, right? I mean, I feel like that's just obviously the case.
So he was not rejecting metaphysics as a whole. He's rejecting. But I guess the question Mike is asking is, how are you then defending your metaphysics?
Yeah, so the atonement isn't really what matters. It's just one example of a million I could give within the Christian worldview, which is you're starting with that as a right. It's like you're starting with that, but you're also not incorporating it in the package at the beginning. It comes later, and I think that's backwards, because as a naturalist, like I have to, like, if I'm going to explain things, I can't go, okay, well, stellar nucleosynthesis, like we'll get to that. Like that's off the table. It doesn't matter. No. Fusing elements up to iron, really matters. And then wire heavier iron or heavier elements above iron and like supernovae, right? Like that matters. I can't just, if someone really wants to know and we're talking about something specific, like the elements, I should have an explanation for that in some way. And it shouldn't be on the back end of it. It should be right at the beginning, baked into my metaphysics. And that's kind of the problem I have.
So what I would say is the idea here that the Christian worldview has a particular metaphysic, that's an ahistorical idea. That's not borne out. And more than that, I would probably say that the Christianity at its core, centered on the cross, is not a worldview. It is a critique of a worldview. And so I'm not. I would say worldview wise, I'm probably purely an existentialist.
Well, let me ask you, like, would you like, because Titan brings up something that I bring up a lot for people in this. Do you believe in angels and demons?
That's okay. That is a very complicated question.
But they're of some other ontology, correct? It's not like a human. That's clearly an angel and a demon are not.
So here's what I'll say. If angels and demons do exist, we have no capacity to experience that. And so as far as we're concerned, they don't.
Yeah, but if that's part of the package, like, so I guess my thing is if you're
again, you keep saying that it's part of the package, but I don't agree to that.
Well, and that's fine. I'm not going to straw man you to say that necessarily is, but I feel like at some point we're going to pinpoint something in there that, because I feel like if we keep doing this and then you say, well, it's not that, then you're shedding yourself to an atheist at some point. You've just gotten rid of all the metaphysical baggage that actually matters, right? And then I don't even know, we're not talking about Christianity anymore, or we're highlighting my initial point, which is that you have one interpretation of so many other, which is the problem, that we can go from this imaginative and have no mechanism to know if Bryans right versus like Darth Dawkins versus like S.J. Thompson, right? Like there's nothing there. They're all on equal playing field, which is that they haven't gotten off the ground from my perspective.
So what I would say is
we have to package everything within your metaphysics now, not later, not when I go, hey, do you believe in demons and stuff? And you go, yeah, I do. Well, why wasn't that introduced? Because in my naturalism, if I believe in that, I have to account for that. Nobody's going to not let me. You know what I mean? Like if I claim sorry, go ahead.
No, I might have lost what I was going to say. Hold on.
No, I'm the worst with that, so I completely understand.
Well, you said something that triggered something in my brain. I'm trying to remember what it was.
Let me go back in my own head here.
It was really important too. Okay.
I'm sorry. That was my fault for rambling on. No. Sorry. The grounding.
You're shedding, basically, I think Mike is suggesting that you're not really talking about Christianity anymore.
Oh, no, okay, yeah. So you talked about the problem is that there's all these different interpretations, right? Mm-hmm. But we wouldn't
Well,
call
no.
that.
You could take one thing and have infinite amount of interpretations of it. Is what I'm saying. You could have the exact same manuscript. Would make no difference. You could have a different interpretation than anyone else. That's a problem.
So here's I think that it's kind of a problem for me. So I won't say that it's completely unproblematic. But one thing I would push back on a little bit is the idea that every interpretation is on equal footing, because I do not believe that to be the case.
Okay, it's perfect. So what's the mechanism that distinguishes yours from the ones that are not?
So there's a lot. Part of it is existential, right? So part of it is how does this fit my experience? Part of it is this historical? Can we back this up with the actual data, the historical context, all that stuff. Those are means by which we can look at better and worse interpretations of a text.
Agreed, but how do you solve like an underdetermination problem there, right? Because I can take experience.
That's a little lingo for me. What do you mean by that?
So essentially, like, what I mean is that if there's underdetermination in some theory, like I could post hoc rival some theory that accounts for the exact data. And so let's use your examples, the historical, your experiential. Now I can take those two components, right, and have an underdetermined rival hypothesis that matches the exact same data that you use, right? And now we're trying to use mechanisms, but now we have a problem of underdetermining whether or not the hypothesis is actually the right one, because I could just account for the same data, and now we have to go further steps. Right now, you have to add more empirical data.
So here's the thing. So as long as there is some objective means to say that the interpretation of these things is not arbitrary, right? It's not arbitrary. It's rooted in something, and we can say which one is better or worse. And let's say we have two of these that come together that are the exact same value of better or worse, that are different, right? For the game that I think the biblical text is playing, that's not a problem, because I think some of that ambiguity is built in on purpose. But I also think that we could probably levy the same criticism about, how do I put this?
We could do it with science. I mean, that's what the problem.
No, I wouldn't say about science.
Well, no, it's a problem in philosophy of science, is the underdetermination problem. You can do that. I don't think it's an actual problem, because what separates that is the novel predictions you derive, and then the fact that you'll be able to falsify certain things. This kind of goes back to what I said earlier. There's a criterion that's going to at least mitigate some underdetermination. I don't think we're like I'm never going to have. Let me put it this way. I'm going to have some epistemic humility and say, like, there could be a rival theory or model that accounts for all the data and really any facet. Like, I think I can't remember the steady something model before the Big Bang. I can't remember it specifically. Right. I think there's portions in that have similar data, but it also extrapolates an eternal universe and other things that aren't accounted for. I think like abundance of light elements and things like that aren't accounted for in the Big Bang model. So there's something there that separates a problem of underdetermination based on the novel predictions that you could derive out of it. I don't know why, since that's successful, why we would shy away from that. It sounds like you are trying to use it, but at the same time, I'm like, how do we do that for something that's historical 2,000 years removed, and then is also based on your sense data, which could just be faulty, or an alien, there's no logical contradiction here, an alien could have just put it into your sense data that Christianity's true or whatever, right? And then you would have no way to tell, because it's going to funnel through your sense data.
Well, so I think this might be a question for Cease, because we're in the space of moral realism, right? So if we're going to take, let me see how I might want to phrase this question. So when we look at, man, this is really hard to put into words. I think my issue with this is not so much that I think that anything that you've said, J. Mike, is wrong. I'm not suggesting that the Bible is even the type of thing that could or should replace scientific inquiry, right? What I'm saying is, it is a ongoing conversation about what it means to be a human being, not expressed in kind of a formulaic way, but in a way that invites participation. Paul Tillich, who's a theologian, you guys probably don't know who he is, but he was a theologian in the 60s.
I've heard of him, actually.
I've not. And kind of when he was talking about, what distinguishes philosophy from theology, because, a lot of people talk about philosophy as encompassing theology, that it's kind of, philosophy is rectangles, theology is squares, and so there's something that differentiates them, but there's significant overlap. And for Paul Tillich, the way that what he talked about was, you are taken up by, I think is his language, what you're pursuing to know, and or that you're it's hard to put into words here, but that's a different thing than science. So my wife, she actually is she is a scientist. She works in biology. She does a lot of work there, and the kind of work that she does there is rigorous, and it's useful, and it's intense. But that's not the kind of work that we do when we're relating to one another, or our children, or the people that we meet on the street. And so what I'm saying is, I'm not trying to dispute the usefulness of scientific inquiry. I'm saying that, and I'm definitely not trying to say that the biblical text can replace it, because it absolutely can't. But what I am trying to say is that the biblical text is playing a different game, and that game is not inconsequential.
You're saying it's... Oh, sorry, go ahead, Cease.
No, I understand where you're coming from. I do think that ultimately, when we talk about existentialism and how we relate to each other, I don't believe we're stepping away from the scientific method as much as you're saying that we are. That I think there's actually...
Maybe I'm overstating my case, because I don't really think that we're stepping away from critical thinking. Like that's a different thing than the scientific method.
No. I'm talking about the scientific method. I don't necessarily buy that. How would I say this? I'm trying to think of how to probably, because a lot's been said. On one hand, I'm all for this kind of experiential approach, and on the other, I think the context and the kind of claims that tend to be derived from experience in the religious context become problematic, because, like,
well, and I don't disagree with that, right? Yeah, good, keep going.
Well, it seems to me like you're talking about Christianity, like not a framework which tells us what is true, but a framework which asks the questions and constructs a dialogue where we may figure out something in the exchange. Similar.
Yeah, so this is in terms of, like, if you want to look at big names in Christian theology that talk about Christianity in this way, Karl Barth is probably the biggest one. He talks about, it's called dialectical theology. And I think you're following what I'm doing here pretty close.
But I think, and maybe you can come back another time to sort of maybe talk about particular scripture. And again, I'm not the scholar here, so I do understand where you're coming from and can even respect it. But it seems to me that that approach, I think, is, you can get there and you can create the picture and it can make sense, but it's like you're doing backflips to get to that interpretation of it. I think there are more problems, there are more claims in the Bible that make it appear to be the kind of document that's doing what you are rejecting.
Say that again. Say that one more time.
Did he freeze?
He may have.
I was gonna say, I don't know if he was done. Because I was also like,
I was like,
hey, sorry, my internet just died for a second.
You're back.
You froze. Could you repeat what you said?
Wait, can you guys see me and hear me now?
Yeah,
you're good.
Okay. Hopefully it doesn't die altogether. What I was saying is that your interpretation, I'm not saying is not a legitimate one, but what I'm saying is that it seems to me that and again, you're the scholar, not me, but from my perspective, when I look at the Bible, it seems to me that there is more room for the interpretations of the Bible that seem to go against your framework. That it's not just a context for dialogue, but it is a document that's making exactly the same kind of statements and claims about reality without the necessary justification that Mike and I would take issue with. And even if we're wrong, maybe your perspective, maybe you can come back and we can go through scripture, and maybe you can do that work and show us where we're wrong there. The problem is then, how do we show the rest of the world who adopt a version of Christianity that is completely counter to what you're putting forth here? How do we bring that to light and change the type of conversation dynamic of the ways in which these things are interpreted to make sense in the 21st century?
Yeah, so that's part of what I do as my work, right? Because I'm a pastor of a Christian community, and so part of my work is how do we frame these stories? How do we frame these images in a way that is helpful, in a way that is in a way that breaks through some of the disconnect? And the best way I find to do that is to problematize it. So to say, all right, so you think the Bible works like in this way? Well, let's throw out 15 examples that shows how that's not a tenable position, and then say, okay, well, if that's not it, what's going on? And talk about that sort of thing. And so that's part of what I do. But one of the things that you said there was, how do we reach out to the people? Because this thing is kind of the minority, and this is one of the weaknesses, I think, of religion in general, is the fundamentalist has an edge in any conversation, because what they can do is, especially if they don't know the original language, they can appeal to the English text and say, well, this is just what it says, and that's the end of it, without digging into the nuance of some of the things that we talked about, where we might weigh interpretations as better or worse. And so they don't even have to deal with that. And so there's a kind of strength that comes with that. At least
how does that work? How does that work though for like Leviticus, 18, I believe, about gays, right? Like how does I don't know how you don't plainly take those types of things, because from the way that you put it in conversational standpoint, like I would say like you could find some success in that in like a very small percentage of the text, but the rest of it is left where that application just doesn't work. It's very explicit in what it means.
So what I want to do is I want to come back to that, but I want to finish my thought before.
Sure. Well, we can do that on a that second part. Let's do that on another time because we are over. But yeah, definitely finish up your point.
The issue that I think, the reason I think that this version of Christianity doesn't have a whole lot of how do I put this, traction, is because this version of Christianity is not a worldview. It is not trying to explain things. What it's trying to do is tear things down and reorient ourselves in the world. So people like answers, and this idea of the cross as kind of the ultimate deconstruction is not an answer filled perspective. And so I think that's partially why. But the what I found in my own experience is when you're really engaging with people and you're really trying to get down in the dirt with people and listen to their experience and live life with them, they're not looking for answers, not those kinds of answers.
Maybe for when you come back, you can provide a response to this idea of underdetermination of theories, because I think that is something that is sort of
I would
problem.
Agree.
I think it's something that even from your perspective, I think it's something to take a look at, because I do think it's a problem for what you're saying.
No, I know. I agree. It is a problem. There's a tradition within Christianity that has been on this side for a really long time. It's the mystics. The mystics have been on this for a very, very long time. Now they have different metaphysical. They come at from different angles from metaphysics. But what I would say, it's not a new problem. It's a problem that goes throughout Christian history, and there has been this tension between the more mystical impulses of Christian faith and the more dogmatic impulses of Christian faith. And I'll just leave that there. I know we're over time, but
let's show a couple of comments. I was just curious as to how you would respond to this comment here.
I'm on my phone now since that thing. So
okay, I'll read it out loud. It says, held intention is an overly charitable way of labeling a self-defeating contradiction. It is not just about usefulness. It calls into question the nature of the author. I think we hold all sorts of things in tension. I don't think that's a self-defeater. I don't think that's a defeater for a situation. Now, it might be if we're playing particular kinds of games. But when it comes to human experience, there are tons of things that we hold in tension.
Okay. Let's see. Are there any other questions? I'm trying to see.
I only can see the recent ones or the last ones. I see pessimistic idealism has one, but that's the only one I can see on my end because I'm on my phone now.
Okay. 1 second.
If you want to scroll up, I can put this one up on the screen. Oh, there you go.
All right. So the Bible is a Socratic primer for humans to figure out the ontology of reality on our own. That's strategy chosen by an omniscient being with eternal dominion. So I think for me, the phrasing of that question is problematic. For one, I would say that the Bible is a human document. It's not a divine document. It doesn't originate from God. And then I would also say that eternal damnation is that's not a concept. That's not a concept that I even entertain.
Sure. You would also reject this idea of an omniscient being because you said that you don't see God as an object. So
right.
Sure.
Sweet. Okay. Let's see. I guess this is for me, I think, and for you, Mike.
Yeah.
would we agree that we should only commit ourselves to propositions that are falsifiable and or are capable of making novel testable predictions?
Should you only play for a basketball team that wins the championship pretty successfully a lot of the times? Well, no. I mean, you could go play for another team and try to build success that way. No problem there. But the way I relate this is, yeah, you should try to get novel predictions. Like, you should try to do that. If you're postulating that isn't going to be necessary for whatever you're doing, that's fine. You've now created a new tool for knowledge. And the way I know Cease is probably so sick of me saying this example, but it's always like, to me, I'm building a house with a hammer, and you're like, do you think the hammer's the best tool? I'm like, well, I'm getting houses done, and
yeah,
I'm making progress. I'm not saying it's the only tool we should use. What do you suggest? And they're like, I look over at their lot, and there's nothing built. They're kicking rocks, and they can't even drive me to fucking Lowe's and show me what aisle the fucking tool is in, right? I can't even lick it to know if it's metal or anything. It's just some idea someone says. So then they come to me, right? They get on their soapbox, and while I'm building, like, cities with this tool, they have to get on our infrastructure, right? Like the internet. And they go, well, should we do this? Well, I don't know. You ask yourself, because the only reason that you could even ask the question from my perspective was on the basis of novel predictions working, and the fact that it resulted in a phone for you to talk to me, some guy in his bedroom in Georgia. Like, you know what I mean? Like, to me, it's ridiculous to claim it if you have nothing to offer, because I just see the person kicking rocks. So no, you don't have to. But don't come to a knife fight, without some other weapon, right? Like, you have to provide something, or else you're going to lose right away.
Before, I don't see a lot of other questions. I'm sorry if I missed any.
Well,
I didn't realize
while you're looking, I wanted to say something that might add some clarity to some of our things about propositional kind of statements. For me, one of the things that I reject is propositional faith. And that was not the tradition I was raised in. So the tradition I was raised in is Christianity is all about accepting a set of propositions. And that I have found to be untenable. And so
you cut out on my end. What was untenable? I'm sorry.
That Christianity is simply the acceptance of a list of propositions.
Okay.
I just want to say before we close up here, and I definitely hope you come back again, because I definitely enjoy our conversations. That my concern with sort of the experiential approach that you're taking is that in that context, I'm concerned that we could all have very different experiences of reality and have no way to sort of make a claim, a sort of a universal claim based on those experiences. Well, something like morality, which is what you were comparing it to.
Yeah.
I don't think the same thing can be said, because I do think that is actually arising from something that is universal and shared, that we don't have a choice in. And maybe, we can have that conversation at some point, or perhaps you can, go back to the conversations that I've had with Mike about my moral framework.
One of the things that I think would be really helpful on that is to look at Harris's, what's the name of Harris's most recent book? I can't even remember what it is.
Waking Up?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is.
The Moral Landscape? Is that what you're...
No, Waking Up. Waking Up. Waking Up. Waking Up is what it is. Because in his work on there, he really talks about how there are these kind of universal experiences that call us to higher senses of being, that the religious traditions have tried to articulate in different ways. Right. And so that might be a fruitful conversation.
Yeah, sure.
100%.
No, that's good.
Yeah, and I wanted to say, Bryan, I love talking to you as well. We got to talk a little bit, but we didn't really, get to run the gambit, so to speak. So I'm definitely happy to have you back on anytime. A lot of people in the comments felt the same too, in terms of Shannon Q. I don't know if you saw, but Shannon Q popped in. She was like, "I love Bryan." So even
next time I'll stand back and you guys can take the.
No, it's well, it doesn't matter how we do it, as long as Bryan comes on, I'm cool with it. So whichever way.
All right, sounds great.
Well, I would love to watch a conversation about just biblical interpretation with you guys.
That I think, in order for, because there is an element where me and Bryan will, and admittedly we talk past each other on certain things because of probably our foundation or how we just get off the ground epistemically and things like that. The Bible part of that, I think, would be really fruitful between us. I think that would be actually something where we'd probably be more in line to explore what that means. We're not going to agree, I don't think necessarily, but I think it'll be less of me probably talking past you on specific points, if that makes sense. Like,
yeah, well, and I think
I want to make sure I get your proper position.
Digging in on like those early Genesis texts and how those are functioning, I think would be a real, because I know you've done some work in those, and so I think that would be a really that would definitely be fruitful.
Yeah, I'd love it. I need to get back into it. Now that I'm doing Talk Heathen, now I've been trying to pick up the Bible more often, but philosophy is really taking over a lot of like, it's all I love to listen and read and stuff now. So now I got to get back into that train. But yeah, thank you again. I need you to actually close this out today, if you can, because I have to do it with my finger, and I feel like I'm gonna fuck everything up.
Let me see if I remember how to do this. I just clicked the live stream ending thing, right?
Well, let me get you ready. Hold on. And everybody, we love you as I'm tilting away from you. Peace out.
Then I